People have been talking about the US getting knocked off its pedestal by China as the world's sole superpower when unipolarity, meaning one world superpower, becomes bipolarity or even multipolarity, more than two powers. Will China ascend to what it considers its predestined spot as a world leader as powerful or more powerful than the US? That's the big question on everyone's mind, but there is one factor that might make this dream unachievable. All we'll say right now is size matters. China's population size really matters when we ask that question. Although the size of China's population has been one of its biggest assets in its rise, it might also result in the country's downfall, making that dream of a multipolar world just that, a dream. Let us first explain what we're talking about when we mention shifting poles of power and how the size of a country's population can change this. Political scientists talk about this a lot, but now terms like unipolar and bipolar power are in the mainstream consciousness. In our research for the show, we read a May 2023 article by the German economic sociologist Wolfgang Streeck. The article is titled, "A Bipolar Order?" Here's a snippet from the first part in which he references the recent Pentagon leaks. To American opponents of the war, Republicans as well as Democrats, the documents confirmed that keeping the Ukrainian army in action might turn out to be unacceptably expensive, all the more since both political parties in the United States agreed that their country had to get ready sooner rather than later for a much bigger war fighting the Chinese in the Pacific. He argues that China doesn't want a unipolar world with itself at the center, and he says for reasons of geography and military capacity, China doesn't want a bipolar world in which it constantly scraps Cold War style with the US. Rather, he says China wants a shared power, a multipolar world. The US has been the world's hegemon since the end of the Cold War, but the world was a multipolar place for centuries before that. Multipolarity is the norm. The US's unipolarity is historically speaking abnormal. The US doesn't want things to change. That's why the Washington Post recently said China's New World Order is taking shape. That was meant as a warning, not a celebratory statement. Despite China's relative peacefulness on the world stage, at least compared to the battle-hardened US of A, people in Washington worry about China's autocratic vision. When President Xi Jinping talks about a peaceful multipolar world order, they don't believe it. As the New York Times wrote in 2023, they worry China wants to create an international system in its illiberal image. They say autocrats don't change their spots, and look at what happened when autocracies went wild. We got Mao, Stalin, and Hitler. Washington doesn't buy into what Xi called his shared future for humankind. Some say that's coming, like it or not, and others say China will not succeed in becoming as powerful as the US, mostly because of the population problem we'll explore soon. A well-known Chinese scholar named Huang Renwei said China would not become the dominant power but only one of them. He said it is impossible for America to contain the rise of China, and it is equally impossible for China to quickly surpass America. But you can find a plethora of articles stating that China has no chance of becoming an equal. The Hill wrote in 2023, China is unquestionably a great power, but a superpower? No way. When it comes to superpower status, it simply doesn't make the cut. Sentiments like this are all over the web. Nonetheless, it would be hard to argue that we are not at a pivotal moment in human history in which there's a rising challenge to the US hegemony. It's not a secret, Xi just went to Moscow to meet with Putin, and together they discussed the multipolarity they say is coming. Xi said in a statement, China will work with Russia to uphold the true multilateralism, promote a multipolar world and greater democracy in international relations, and help make global governance more just and equitable. Plenty of other countries have said they want this new multipolar order, including the emerging powers India and Brazil. They say it's pretty much already here. Others agree. Foreign Policy magazine said in 2023, the Biden administration is striving for a unipolar order that no longer exists. So, there you go. That's the talk of the town. Will China become the US's equal in global power? While many say it's coming, many say it isn't. And one of the reasons they say that is because of China's population problem. This, they say, plays a bigger role than any military disadvantages China might have. Right now, there are around 1.45 billion people living in China, making it slightly more populated than India, which weighs in at about 1.42 billion. Taking the third spot on the list is the USA with a population of 336.5 million. Some of these numbers are going to change quite drastically in the next few decades. We'll just add that some population counters put India now ahead of China. That doesn't really matter for this show today, they're both packed. That's all you need to know. Population prediction is certainly not an exact science. Anything can happen. To give you an example, many people in the 1960s said the world's population would get so big that much of the planet would starve to death. In the well-received book The Population Bomb, a Stanford researcher wrote, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death, in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate. Just bear in mind that there are alarmists among us. Still, if the predictors of the population have gotten it right, by 2050, India will have the largest population at around 1.66 billion. The US will be similar to the present at 375 million. China will decrease to 1.31 billion. Japan will also decrease from 126 million to 104 million. Indonesia and Pakistan will drastically increase, as will Nigeria, which will go from 206 million to a massive 375 million. Much of Africa will see a huge population growth. Africa's economies are going to expand thanks in part to China. CNBC reported in 2021 China is Africa's largest two-way trading partner, hitting $254 billion. The same report mentioned China's charm offensive and talked about the USA's dwindling influence on the continent. In 2022, the Biden administration accused China of trying to weaken US-Africa relations and to challenge the rules-based international order and advance its own narrow commercial and geopolitical interests. This matters in the view of today's show. China has befriended a lot of emerging economies that it will need down the line, especially if its population will go down as predicted. In terms of China and its population issues, the one thing you've probably all heard of is the country's one-child policy. This was first introduced in the late 70s and in the early 80s nationwide as a way to reduce the Chinese population. It officially ended in 2016, but what happened during that time will haunt China for many years to come. While it lasted, China made various contraceptive methods available to just about everyone, and it also offered financial incentives and sometimes better job opportunities for the people who complied. At the same time, those who didn't follow the rule were sometimes hit by economic sanctions or other kinds of sanctions. In some cases, there were forced abortions and sterilizations. The birth rate did decrease, but people started living longer and the death rate dropped during the period. This was a country that previously under Mao Zedong and his disastrous policies lost anywhere from 40 to 80 million people as a result of persecution, execution, and the worst, starvation. Mao's policies in his Great Leap Forward were a jump out of the frying pan and into the fire of famine. Under Mao's leadership, the Chinese government wholly embraced pro-natalist policies, and there were incentives for families to create larger numbers of workers. In such harsh times, kids were seen as a safety net. The very bleakest realization of this was people selling their kids on the road for a bowl of rice. While millions died under Mao, people were incentivized to have more kids. In the era from the 1950s to the 1960s, the Chinese population growth was about 2% per year, but in 2007, it was down to 0.7% per year. This was some change, and it was welcomed by all of those people we mentioned earlier that were sounding the alarm regarding misery and famine coming to humans on a global scale. China later viewed its large population as a problem during its time as a staunchly socialist country. As its population increased, more people needed to be taken care of in old age. They needed education, old folks needed looking after, everyone needed healthcare, everyone required rice. But China changed to a socialist market economic system, and as you know, its market-based system led to what's frequently called a meteoric economic rise. Just so you know, for centuries China had been one of the most advanced nation on the planet, thinking the wealthy Europeans were barbarians when they were trying to do business with China in the 17th and 18th centuries. In 1820, China's economy was 6 times larger than Great Britain's, the biggest in Europe, and 20 times larger than the economy of the growing USA. That all changed, and we won't go into why today, but let's just say China didn't like it when it went from being the world's superpower to being reduced to what some people called the sick man of Asia. China now needs more people so it can keep prospering. It's gone from mandatory sterilization and forced abortion to now trying to get the Chinese population to fall in love, get hitched, and start having babies. There used to be the one-child policy propaganda posters all over the place, and now China is begging people to start pumping out more babies. In 2015, the Communist Party propagated the slogan, "One is too few, while 2 are just right." Right now, one of the slogans is "One to marry off, one for old age caring." But in 2021, it changed tack and said 3 babies are better than 2. Chinese netizens wrote that they simply couldn't afford 3 kids. One person wrote on Weibo, a platform like Twitter, "People don't want to have children not because of the absence of a 3-children policy, but because we can't afford it." Another person wrote that China needs to provide the most fundamental maternity welfare and solve the unfair treatment women face at the workplace for giving birth. She told its citizens more babies were needed to improve the structure of China's population, implement the national strategy of actively responding to the aging population, and maintain China's human resource advantages. Still, it seems quite obvious that most people are not prepared to go down the three-kid route. This could be problematic for China's future. Another person said online, "We don't even have time to date anyone. How could we have time to have children? 996 is the best birth control, don't they understand?" What he meant by that was working 9 to 9, 6 days a week. China wants productivity. It's renowned for its productivity, but many people are sick of being treated like Roman slaves constructing buildings they'll never enter. Meanwhile, China now has a new policy that says young people should take care of their parents. Right now, there's no legislation that'll punish someone for not doing that, but the government is actively relying on people to look after their mom and dad. A poem on Weibo summed up how difficult it is to do what the government wants. One family, 2 partners. Give birth to 3 children, while taking care of 4 elderly. Go to work at 8 a.m., sign off at 9 p.m. Make 10 times the effort to pay off a mortgage of millions. Many countries, including the US, are at some point going to have problems when there are too many old people to look after and not enough young folks for innovating and making money. But China's problem is probably more profound. In 2022, the Chinese government said 9.56 million people were born and 10.41 million people died. This was the first time deaths outnumbered births since Mao's Great Leap into Famine. By 2025, China will have 300 million people over 60 years old. By 2035, the number of 60-plus will be 400 million. This will be a really big issue for a country that wants to wear the crown in what might be a multipolar palace. Not even the government offering cash handouts for new babies has made a dent in the decline. We've already shown you how a number of Chinese folk think. They just don't want kids when life is already so hard for them. According to the French historical demographer Emmanuel Todd in 2022, this population crisis is exactly what will stop China from becoming a superpower. He also talked about the fact that China has way more males than females, which is a result of the one-child policy when males were favored over females. There are presently 104.7 males to 100 females in China. It means a lot of men without partners, many of them being the poorest men. China calls these eligible men guanggun, meaning bare branches or bare sticks. Lots of marginalized men will no doubt lead to social instability and possibly higher rates of crime. A healthy population is more or less equal in terms of sex. Todd talked about this and said, "It is completely unrealistic to assume that China will transform into an all-powerful and threatening superpower in the future." He sees instability ahead and social upheaval as inequality worsened by the population crisis destabilizes what's been a relatively good time for China over the last 2 decades or so. China's been called the factory of the world, and for a good reason, but it's facing labor shortages on an unprecedented scale. Sure, China's economic growth for 2022 was 3%, better than the USA's 2.1%. But for China, that was the slowest growth it's seen in almost 40 years. It's quite normal for population growth to decrease when the average Joe has a better standard of education and living. People generally live longer too when their standards of living improve. This has happened, but much faster than China expected. It's serious and China knows it. That's why Xi has said his country's demographic challenges are a top priority. He says he will now introduce a national policy system to boost birth rates. Still, he's tried that already and nothing changed. So some experts say China's massive population decline and old people increase is nailed on. There's nothing China can do about it, they say, short of 1984-style Big Brother police going out into the streets and forcing people to procreate. Speaking of Big Brother, we guess you heard about China's social credit system. The way this has been portrayed is like an episode of Black Mirror in which everything you do in life is like a video game. So if you decide to clean your room or read a biography of Xi, you get rewarded points. But if you decide to drink a bottle of wine instead or watch some illegal adult content, you're docked points. More points leads to a better life, a dystopian nightmare of mass surveillance. A European politician not long ago said, "It is the beginning of slavery, complete control, and the disappearance of all freedom." The problem is much of the Western world has got it wrong. China's social credit system is nothing like that. Citizens don't get points for their everyday actions. The system is more about businesses. It's nothing like the dystopian system you might have heard about and dreaded that it's coming to a city near you. So it's doubtful China will start making its citizens' lives miserable through a point system if they don't have more kids, at least for now. Sometimes what we hear is anti-China propaganda, which the Diplomat in 2023 called off the charts, and a hysteria all over the Western media. Rather than balanced stories, said the article, we get fabricated stories with no evidence. So, China is not going to be able to force people to have children. Still, the population problem is almost certainly going to happen. There are going to be vast numbers of old people scattered all over the country, many of them living in villages when their kids have gone off to the cities to work. They will need to be taken care of. In 2020, there were 3.74 working-age folks for one retiree in China. But it's thought that by 2045, there will only be 1.68 working people for one retiree. How will this work? Maybe China, like many nations, is hoping technology will take care of the population deficit. We all know that artificial intelligence is getting more intelligent. There is a kind of Cold War of technology going on between the US and China, which is why the US has tried to make it difficult for China to make its own microchips or import them. China says it'll become self-sufficient in this regard, but not for a while. Both these nations know that getting ahead in technology is the key to success. China might be hoping when the chips are down, the chips will save it. Another thing is migration. Could China sort out its population problem by inviting people to China to work? We've already told you that China has made friends all over the world, especially in Africa, and many other countries too. It must be said that China is no melting pot, not like the USA or the UK anyway. Chinese millennials are not marrying like other generations, but if they do get married, they tend to marry people who share the same culture and traditions. China is quite a closed door in terms of immigration, and culturally it's quite homogeneous compared to the US. One list we found said China was in 125th place for the most ethnically diverse countries in the world. Another thing with immigration pushes is there is the possibility of more social instability. But how will China get enough people to fill their workplaces if they don't have enough homegrown workers? In 2050, it's expected the median age in China will be 50, up from the present 38. As one author wrote, China's population decline and aging population is a reminder of America's great advantage in being open to talented, hardworking immigrants from around the world. The same arguments continue, with the US saying the rise of China threatens the world order. Then China fires back with its own refrain, saying the so-called international order is designed to serve the US's own interest and perpetuate its hegemony. The US calls China the enemy at the door, and China says the US is the largest source of disruption to the actual world order. These bouts of sparring continue as the two nations trade with each other on a mega scale. China is the US's biggest trading partner after Mexico and Canada. US imports from China in 2022 grew by 6.3% to $536.8 billion. US exports to China grew by 1.5% year-on-year, but were only $153.8 billion. What this means is that despite the US not wanting China to grow, it's the US's imports that have helped China grow. Sure, the rest of the world has heavily relied on the factory of the world, but the US is China's biggest single-country trading partner, meaning not as big as the EU, but bigger than any one nation. So, as these two countries have a war of words, they are kinda like an elderly couple who bicker all the time and sleep in separate beds. Right now, if one were to die, the other would suffer tremendously, thinking, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" People have talked about decoupling the US economy from China's, but it won't be easy. Writing for the New York Times in 2022, an analyst said, "It has become clear that China is not a friend or a partner in development, but rather an adversary bent on world dominance." He added, "The best way to avoid a military crisis is to maintain our economic superiority." But China is winning, since the US imports a lot more than it exports to China. Britain has had this problem in the past, and it solved it by selling opium to China on the black market. It caused the Opium War and led to China's so-called Century of Humiliation. The US will have to sort out its trade deficit by different means. Meanwhile, China is fastidious in trying not to be humiliated again. The analyst we just mentioned says it's time to rethink this business relationship and continue trade and economic activity beneficial to us and to discourage any part that is not. The trade imbalance needs to be balanced, he said. But what's going to happen when China's population decreases? Will the US already have fixed this imbalance? What will happen to the rest of the world that relies on Chinese goods? China's so-called demographic time bomb will be felt the world over. Prices of many things you buy might inflate. Will countries look to trade with other Asian nations whose populations are set to fly, such as India and Indonesia? Southeast Asia is also predicted to shine in the near future. One analyst said the ability of the Chinese economy to be the engine of global growth that it has been in the past looks increasingly in question. So, who will fill China's shoes? Some indeed said India will be the next China, but India is a long way behind China as a manufacturing power, and analysts say it'll stay that way for many years. Still, who knows what'll happen in 2 decades? Another analyst said China's demographic and economic outlook is much bleaker than expected. China will have to adjust its social, economic, defense, and foreign policies. In Washington, words like those are music to the ears, but they know China's banking on switching from a labor-intensive economy to a much more high-tech one. That's why pundits are saying the only way to stop China's rise is to cut it off technologically. Still, as some countries talk about raising the retirement age, some U.S. lawmakers are thinking about raising the age from 66 or 67 to 70. China's retirement age is 50 for women and 60 for men. With such a low retirement age, could China really be feeling that desperate? And what if it makes the retirement age higher? It's looking like it might have to, but this might lead to some of that social instability we talked about earlier. One prediction states that by the year 2100, China's population will only be 800 million. That sounds bad, but by the time we get there, artificial intelligence will likely be driving you to work, telling you stories, and wiping your backside after you've emancipated some lab-made beef. If the world is still unipolar by then, just be glad we still have a world, and we haven't pushed the go extinct button because we couldn't get along. Now you need to watch Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a disaster for China, or have a look at Meet the Man responsible for the most deaths in history.